A Soviet attack helicopter, a machine of legendary menace, sits broken but priceless on an abandoned runway. It is June of 1988, a spoil of war left behind in the chaotic aftermath of the conflict in Chad. The secrets locked within its armored skin are now just a few hours of darkness away from being stolen, and its guardians have no idea the hunt has already begun. The year is 1988, Ouadi Doum Air Base, a strip of concrete like a tongue, burned into the northern Chadian desert, lies under a sky so hot it seems to bend the light at the horizon. Heat shimmers off the tarmac in waves, distorting the skeletons of a forgotten war. The wrecks scattered across the apron are a testament to a hasty and violent retreat. The turrets of T-55 tanks are yawed to the side like dead eyes staring at nothing. Support vehicles are rolled and hollowed out by fire, and the bitter little stubs of burned antennas curl at odd, forgotten angles. The rust of the recent war is everywhere. The silence that fills the base is not one of peace, but of abandonment, the unsettling quiet of a place the living have fled in such haste that things remain half-made and half-destroyed. At one end of the apron, incongruously whole, sits a Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter. It is a machine designed to be menace incarnate. Its tubby fuselage is armored as if shielded by a knight, and its tandem glass cockpit, now blinking with a network of cracks, looks like a fractured insectoid face. Its massive rotor blades droop in the oppressive sun, feathered and dark against the pale sky. A fine scrim of sand, the color of rust, hugs its belly, clinging to the patches of oil and hydraulic fluid that weep from its seams. Bullet pocks dot the metal skin like old scabs. By its mere presence, solid and brooding, it makes the vast, empty tarmac look smaller. Hundreds of miles away to the Soviet advisors stationed in Tripoli, this captured Hind is a jewel. Not a jewel of wealth, but something far more dangerous, a jewel of intelligence. The West has seen the Hind in action. They know how it fights, but what they do not know are the secrets stamped into the metal and woven into the wiring of the machine itself. They do not know exactly how deep the titanium bathtub that protects the crew really is. They do not know the precise frequencies and waveforms of the infrared jammers designed to fool a Stinger missile's scream. They do not know the exact composition of the rotor blades or the vulnerabilities in the armor along the engine seams. These are the secrets that keep Soviet colonels awake at night. The thought of this machine in American or French hands, held under the cold, unforgiving light of a laboratory, turns their sleep into a series of mechanical nightmares. Then one morning, it vanishes. In Tripoli, the intelligence officers cannot find words that fit the emptiness on the photograph. The grainy reconnaissance image taken by a high-flying aircraft returns from the north, showing an apron. Without its prize, the wreckage of the T-55s is still there, the burned-out trucks are still there, but the spot where the Hind had sat is empty. There is no new wreckage, no scorch mark from an explosion, no tracks leading away into the desert. The image is the sort of thing that turns a man's face to stone. Denial moves through the compound first, a misinterpretation of the image, perhaps, a shadow, a wind-blown smear of sand. And then, like a slow-acting acid, comes the terror. The night the Hind disappeared, the dunes had hidden more than just the usual desert winds. There had been a haze of sand, but not a storm violent enough to bury a 12-ton machine whole. The Bedouin scouts, who were later paid to slip through the surrounding minefields and inspect the site, report something strange. The ground where the Hind had rested, they say, has been rubbed clean, as if a giant circular palm had scoured the sand away. They use the old words of the desert, a wind sweep, a sudden wash. The technicians in Moscow who will later read this report will hear something else in those words, the hollow metallic click of a lock tumbling open. The jewel has not been destroyed, it has been taken. As the sun rises over Tripoli, Colonel Petrov, the GRU station chief, has been awake for hours. He is a thin man with a permanent, waxy pallor that comes from spending too many nights in rooms lit by the cold glow of microwave data links. His office is a storm of paper and stale smoke. Cigarette ash scalds a glass ashtray, and maps and glossy photo prints are arrayed across his desk like the bones of a dead animal he is trying to reassemble. He holds each new reconnaissance photograph up to the lamp, staring at it until the edges of the image curve and the grain of the film begins to play tricks on his eyes. Petrov is a man who believes in lists, in procedure, and in the immutable logic of time. Procedure is a religion to him. A helicopter, a 12-ton machine of steel and titanium, does not simply evaporate. A helicopter requires people and fuel and noise and tracks. It leaves a signature. The clean, empty space on the Ouadi Doum tarmac is an insult to his worldview. Something has happened that his models, his entire professional understanding of the world, does not include. The report from the Bedouin scouts, with its strange talk of a windsweep that has rubbed the sand clean, only deepens his unease. He knows the desert, he knows its winds. This was not the work of nature. This was the signature of a massive artificial downdraft, the kind created by the rotors of a heavy-lift helicopter. But who has a helicopter that can lift a Hind? And how could they have flown it hundreds of miles into hostile territory, landed, and flown out without being detected? In Moscow, the news of the disappearance is taken personally. The Central Committee, a body of men sutured together by decades of rigid protocol and a deep-seated paranoia, does not see a tactical loss. They see an ideological insult. In the closed, wood-panelled rooms where national strategy is decided, the theories begin to clot the air, thick and acrid as the cigarette smoke. The first and most obvious suspect is France. The French have a major military presence in Chad. They have the logistical capability, the special forces, and the political motive. Perhaps they sent a convoy of heavy trucks overland, a daring ground raid under the cover of night. Perhaps they used a hovercraft, a new technology that could glide over the minefields. But the timeline doesn't fit. The area is too remote, the ground too difficult. The next theory is bribery. Perhaps the local Chadian forces guarding the airfield had been paid off. It's plausible. The region is awash in competing loyalties and foreign money. Maybe they had allowed a team to come in, dismantle the Hind piece by piece, and haul it away on trucks. This theory is comforting in a way. It suggests a failure of their allies, not a failure of their own security posture. Then comes the darkest theory, the one that is always whispered first in the halls of the KGB. Treachery. Perhaps a defecting Libyan pilot, one with a grievance against the regime, had managed to repair the Hind, get it running, and simply fly it away. This is the worst category of human failure in the Soviet world, a world where the greatest sin is a betrayal of the system. Petrov's list of potential suspects is exhaustive, and his finger never strays far from the button that would trigger a series of arrests and brutal interrogations. But none of the theories quite fit the strange, clean evidence of the scene. A ground convoy would have left tracks, thousands of them. Dismantling a Hind in a single night is a Herculean task that would have left a mess of discarded parts and fluids. A defector flying the Hind out would have been detected by Libyan radar. The clean sand, the absence of wreckage, the sheer silent audacity of the act points to something else, something new and terrifying. It points to an enemy with a capability they have not yet imagined. They are looking for a convoy of trucks, and they should be looking at the empty sky. While Colonel Petrov chased ghosts of French commandos and Libyan traitors, the truth was being quietly assembled on a corkboard in a dim prefabricated building in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Here, in the home of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, a man named Major Hank Calder pinned a fresh photograph to the board. It was a grainy, high-altitude shot of the Hind sitting alone on the tarmac at Ouadi Doum. Hank chewed his thumbnail and watched the image until the lines of the helicopter softened in his vision, until it was no longer a photograph, but a problem of physics and will. Hank had been in the 160th for nearly 15 years. He'd flown helicopters on nights that felt like they had teeth in weather that was not on any forecast. The sort of men who ended up in the 160th, the unit that would become known as the Night Stalkers, carried certain privileges that were not in any official regulation, a deep and abiding tolerance for the impossible, and a quiet willingness to live with the metallic taste of fear in their throats for hours on end. To the men of the 160th, the Hind was not a political symbol or an intelligence jewel. It was a question of lift, drag, and fuel. Hank's board was not covered with maps of political influence. It was covered with the brutal mathematics of the mission. There were weight tables meticulously calculated for the Mi-25 Hind, stripped of its ordnance and rotors. There were rotor RPM graphs for the MH-47 Chinook, charting its performance in the thin, hot air of a desert night. There were heat and density altitude calculations that predicted down to the pound how much lift the Chinooks could generate. And there were diagrams, hand-drawn and precise, showing exactly where the Hind's center of gravity would sit under the Chinook's external sling, and how it might behave in a crosswind. The Americans, if you asked them, would call the operation simply logistics plus guts. For weeks they had been rehearsing. At the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, under a desert sun that mimicked the Sahara, they had practiced lifting objects of similar size and weight. They dragged massive, water-filled bladders across the sand, logging hours, learning the subtle, terrifying harmonics of carrying a heavy, unstable external load. They had tuned their fuel stops to the single gallon. The plan required two massive MH-47 Chinooks to fly hundreds of miles into hostile airspace, one to perform the lift, the other to provide security and support. A single miscalculation in fuel consumption, a single unexpected headwind, would mean crossing the final, empty stretch of desert with two birds, one of them a dead weight, swinging like a giant pendulum, and not enough fuel to make it home. Hank liked to joke, in the dry, understated way of his profession, that you can measure courage technically, but it does not make it less terrifying. Courage, he told his young crews, was not about being fearless. It was just a decision to do smart things in bad conditions for long enough to get the job done. The plan was the smart thing. It was a chain of logistical miracles, C-5 Galaxy transport planes, to move the Chinooks and their support crews into a secret forward base, a fleet of tankers to provide mid-air refueling, and a quiet, high-level liaison with French air controllers in the region who would be persuaded to keep their radar operators looking the other way on a specific night. The guts would be up to the men in the cockpits. The plan was a spine of iron laid across the map. The pilots and crews would have to provide the muscle and the nerve to make it work. The Soviets were looking for a conspiracy. The Americans were planning a piece of high-risk, heavy-lift choreography. In the small, silent hours of a moonless June night, the operation unfolds with the precision of a mechanical ballet. The two MH-47 Chinooks, their fuselages painted a flat, non-reflective black, roll onto a hidden airstrip. The desert night seems to suck the sound out of the world. The massive helicopters, their rotors turning slowly at first, seem to whisper across the hardened ground, as if the machines themselves are trying to be polite. The logistics tail that has brought them here is a spine of iron stretching across the map. C-5 Galaxy transports have moved them into theater, and a chain of air tankers is already orbiting in the high, cold darkness, waiting. The Chinooks launch low, hugging the contours of the desert floor. Their pilots, wearing the large, binocular-like tubes of night vision goggles, see the world not in color, but in a ghostly, ethereal green. The ground rushes by just feet below them, a monochrome landscape of rock and sand. They are not flying, they are skimming, their profiles swallowed by the darkness and the curvature of the earth. From a distant Libyan forward observation post, a lone soldier, peering through a Soviet-made night optic, sees something he cannot name. It is a formless, darker blot against the already black horizon, a brief flicker of movement, and then a sudden rush of wind that kicks up the sand. He has been trained to identify and name threats. The silhouette of a French Mirage jet, the rumble of a truck convoy. This fits no category. He scribbles a note in his log, a slow, anomalous blip on the short-range radar, lasting only 3 seconds. He chalks it up to a flock of birds or a pocket of atmospheric clutter. The radar operator in the regional command center, seeing the same fleeting return, files a similar dismissive note and forgets it. The ghosts have passed unseen. On the silent tarmac at Ouadi Doum, the ground team, delivered by the second Chinook, which lands a short distance away, moves like shadows with a singular purpose. They are a small, elite handful of mechanics and riggers from the 160th, men who can splice a steel cable or jury-rig a lifting harness using only radio codes and sheer muscle. They have practiced this exact sequence 100 times in the New Mexico desert. They carry no heavy cranes or lifting equipment. The primary Chinook, now hovering directly over the derelict Hind, will be the crane. Under the Chinook's belly, a crew chief, secured by a safety harness, leans out into the roaring, sand-filled darkness. The cables, pre-positioned for the lift, shine like silver ropes in the dim, covert lights from the helicopter's cabin. The ground team swarms the Hind, their movements economical and swift. They attach the heavy-duty slings to the reinforced lifting points on the Hind's fuselage, the connections they have memorized and practiced in their sleep. The Hind lies on the tarmac like a giant dead beetle, waiting to be flipped. There is a moment in every heavy lift when physics stops being a written law on a chart and becomes a brutal, terrifying negotiation. The pilot of the lead Chinook, Hank Calder, eases the collective up, his hands steady on the controls. The Chinook's twin rotors bite into the thin, hot desert air, fighting for every ounce of lift. The cables, which had been hanging slack, snap taut with a sound like a deep, metallic groan. The slings tighten, the first, terrible strain of the Hind's 12-ton dead weight transferring to the Chinook's airframe. The Hind thuds once against the concrete, then shudders. For a heart-stopping second it seems fused to the ground. Then, slowly, reluctantly, it rises. The moment its wheels leave the tarmac, the full force of the Chinook's rotor wash, a man-made hurricane, slams into the ground. The sand and debris on the apron scream outward in a roiling circular wave, scouring the concrete, clean in a sudden, photogenic gust. This is the wind sweep, the Bedouins will later describe, the giant palm that has seemingly wiped the desert floor. The lift itself takes only a few minutes, but for the crews, it is an eternity stretched thin. The pilot and co-pilot in the Chinook's cockpit are no longer flying an aircraft, they are managing a barely contained crisis. Their eyes dart across the instruments, their minds focused on a handful of critical numbers. The torque needles, which are quivering at the very edge of the red line. The gearbox temperature, which is climbing steadily, and the subtle, deep harmonics of the straining engines and rotors. The Hind, even stripped of its weapons and with its own rotors removed, is an ungainly, aerodynamically disastrous prize. Wet with residual battle damage and holding a small amount of trapped fuel, its belly sloughs out mass that pushes the Chinook to the absolute maximum of its certified load limit. For this one night, in this one place, the laws of physics are being bent, not broken, and the margin for error is 0. With the Hind finally airborne, dangling beneath the Chinook like a captured beast, the most dangerous phase of the mission begins. The return flight is not a simple transit. It is a battle against gravity, wind, and the terrifying dynamics of an unstable external load. Hank's crew had rehearsed every contingency, fired every possible failure into their simulator. They had planned for alternate refueling points, established a secret forward arming and refueling point, FARP, at a dry lake bed deep in the desert, and coordinated with their French liaisons to keep local air patrols blind to their trail. But even with all that planning, the reality of the flight feels like trying to carry a thundercloud by a string. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze on the ground, rises and falls in savage, unpredictable moods at their low altitude. As they fly north, hugging the terrain, they enter a pocket of severe turbulence. For an hour, the two Chinooks are flying inside a red curtain of dust, a localized sandstorm that reduces visibility to 0. Their night vision goggles, which rely on ambient light and thermal differentiation, become useless, greening out into a solid, featureless wall. The pilots are now flying completely blind, relying solely on their instruments. This is the moment where raw instinct and years of training take over. They are no longer seeing the world, they are feeling it through the vibrations of the airframe and the feedback in the controls. Their gods are the gauges, the artificial horizon, the airspeed indicator, the torque meter. The prize swinging below them, the 12-ton Hind, begins to describe a slow, sickening pendulum path, its movement tugging at the Chinook's flight envelope, threatening to throw the helicopter into an unrecoverable roll. The pilots in the lead Chinook work as a seamless team, their voices calm and professional over the intercom, a stark contrast to the violence of their situation. They make constant, tiny step inputs on the controls, counter rolls, and subtle power adjustments, prayers their hands and feet have learned to make without conscious thought. At one point, the Hind sways violently, rolling unexpectedly on its slings. The belly of the captured helicopter threatens to kiss the unseen desert floor, a disaster that would instantly destroy both aircraft. In the back of the Chinook, the crew chiefs, their faces grim, curse into their headsets and do what their trained hands know to do. They check the sling tension, they call out the pendulum's motion to the pilots, they adjust, they hold, they breathe. After what feels like a lifetime, they break through the dust cloud and into the clear, cold night air. The green world of their night vision snaps back into focus. Ahead, they see the faint, coded infrared strobes of their destination. They have reached the safety of the FARP, a patch of black on black in the middle of nowhere. The landing is as delicate and dangerous as the takeoff. The Chinook pilot slowly, carefully, lowers the Hind onto the desert floor, the 12-ton weight coming off his rotors with a collective sigh from the airframe. The second Chinook lands nearby, its crew disembarking to form a security perimeter. The men from the first helicopter, who could have slept for days, instead drink coffee that tastes of gasoline and adrenaline and immediately tear into the next phase of the operation. Time is still the enemy. The Hind, as it is too large to fit into the cavernous cargo bay of the C-5 Galaxy transport that is waiting for them at another, more established, secret airbase further west. The ground crew, working under the dim, red-lensed lights of their headlamps, begins the work of further disassembly. They are not just mechanics, they are specialists in brute force engineering. They remove the Hind's stub wings, its tail boom, anything that can be unbolted or, if necessary, cut away to reduce its profile. The race is now against the dawn. Exfiltration is an arithmetic problem, a contest between the speed of their wrenches and the rotation of the Earth. By sunrise, this temporary footprint in the desert must be gone, and the prize must be on its way to a place where the sun shines on a different continent. By sunrise, Ouadi Doum Air Base is the same sun-scorched graveyard it was the day before, with one crucial, baffling exception. The craterless spot where the Mi-25 Hind had sat is now a clean, almost unnaturally smooth ring of scrubbed sand. The first high-altitude reconnaissance flights later that day will puzzle over that ring, their analysts eventually attributing it to an unusual circular wind pattern, a meteorological anomaly. The French, comfortable in their air superiority over the region, log their normal patrol flights and do not notice the faint, ghostly traces of two heavy helicopters that had danced through the gaps in their radar coverage. Back in Tripoli, Colonel Petrov and the GRU stare at the new photographs, their minds trapped in a prison of flawed assumptions. They read the absence not as an act of audacious lift, but as a triumph of sophisticated ground sabotage, a mystery they will never solve because they are looking in the wrong place. The lift, codenamed Operation Mount Hope in the classified American memos, or simply That Night in Chad for those who remember it, ends with the disassembled Hind being winched into the cavernous belly of a C-5 Galaxy. The massive transport plane takes off, winging its way west across the Atlantic, carrying a secret that will fundamentally change the balance of power in the sky. In a secure, windowless hangar at a U.S. Army aviation facility in Alabama, the Hind is reassembled. Here, under the pale, constant glow of fluorescent lights, a new team of specialists begins its work. These are not commandos or pilots, but engineers, the men and women of the Army's Threat Systems Management Office. Their hands have learned to speak the language of metal, stress fractures, and wiring schematics. The work they begin is a kind of prose that cannot be dignified by simple description. They strip the Hind down to its bare frames. They measure the thickness of every armor panel with ultrasonic instruments. They map the emissions of its electronic systems, and they record the infrared signature of its engines from every conceivable angle. Men who have been taught to puncture myths with hard data begin to laugh in a quiet, exhausted, and deeply satisfied way. The engineers' findings are not the explosive single-point revelations that the GRU had feared. There is no magical new technology, no single, unbeatable system. Instead, their discoveries are precise, mundane, and in their totality, fatal to the Hind's reputation. They confirm that the helicopter's active infrared jammer, the L-166 Leaper, a device the Soviets had considered a small technological miracle, is indeed effective, but only in a limited set of frequency bands. The American analysts now know exactly which frequencies those are and can program their missiles to ignore them. They analyze the armor plating. The titanium bathtub around the cockpit is indeed thick, just as Soviet doctrine claimed, but the analysis reveals that the seams where the plates are joined and the areas around the engine cowlings are vulnerable. The Americans now have a precise map of the Hind's weak points. They learn which attack arcs will yield the maximum effect, which angles will allow a smaller caliber round to penetrate. They study the Hind's engines and its flight characteristics. They discover the exact engine response times, the subtle delays between a pilot's input and the machine's reaction. They learn how to bait the Hind into predictable maneuvers, how to exploit its poor high-altitude performance, and how to use its own impressive weight and momentum against it. They have, in essence, acquired the manufacturer's blueprint for how to kill a terror. They are no longer fighting a monster of myth and legend. They are now fighting a machine with known and predictable failure modes. The ghost has been dissected, and its secrets are now numbers in a database. Back in Moscow, the eventual leaked confirmation that the Hind has been taken whole triggers a cathartic panic. The houses of doctrine that had once seemed as solid as monuments begin to show hairline fractures of decay. The failure is not just one of hardware, but of imagination. A system that believed secrecy and steel were an absolute defense has been undone by an enemy who simply asked a better question. Not how do we fight it, but how do we move it? The theft of the Hind becomes one of 1,000 small cuts that over the final years of the Cold War bleed the Soviet military-industrial complex of its confidence and its reputation. The consequences ripple outward. Doctrine changes slowly and stubbornly because systems of great scale always resist change. Manuals for Hind pilots are rewritten, forbidding certain maneuvers that the Americans now know how to exploit. Flight profiles are altered. New designs like the Mi-28 Havoc and the K-50 Hokum are pushed forward in defense budgets that are already stretched thin, their development accelerated to counter the now-known vulnerabilities of their predecessor. For the soldiers in the field, in places like Afghanistan, the theoretical threat of a new American anti-helicopter tactic becomes a real and immediate danger, measured in seconds of exposure and the angle of approach. There is, however, another side to this story that the maps and memos cannot capture: the quiet pride of the men who carried it out, and the cold dread of the men who discovered its absence. Major Hank Calder and his crew drank together that night in a tent whose canvas smelled of machine oil and desert dust. They swapped small lies about luck and whispered about the unpredictable wind. Hank, who had felt the first terrible lurch of mass as the Hind lifted off the tarmac, held a small, private opinion that he would carry for the rest of his life. This was less about the superiority of their equipment and more about the quality of people who could hold the line in the dark. Colonel Petrov, for his part, ordered more photographs and thicker windows on his office. He closed files in the late hours and woke with new obsessions: loyalty, traces, and the shape of things that cannot be measured. He would not sleep easily for months, walking the corridors of the embassy at night, counting the catchphrases of Soviet doctrine to himself like a rosary, hoping that repetition might make them true again. When history wants to measure the true effect of this audacious operation, it points to the skies over the Persian Gulf. In 1991, when coalition forces moved into Kuwait and Iraq, the air was a different kind of argument. American Apache and Cobra pilots, who had trained against the captured Hind in the deserts of Alabama and at the top-secret test ranges at McClellan, took that intimate familiarity into combat. The maps that had once told stories of fear now led to tactical options. The enemy's electronic signature was known and could be jammed. Its armor's weak points were known and could be exploited. The machines that had once inspired a primal dread in NATO forces were now engaged with a calm, clinical efficiency, a confidence that had, in part, been purchased on a single, moonless night in the Sahara. That is the pragmatic part of this story. A heist of steel yields a practice of knowledge. The other part is human, the small humiliations and the private certainties. The Soviet Union did not collapse because one helicopter was snatched from a desert. Nations fail or survive by 1,000 cuts of resource allocation and policy choices, but the theft was a deep incision, a proof of concept that mobility, audacity, and information could defeat static mass and secrecy. It proved a lesson that the architects of large, lumbering arsenals had never wanted to learn. Years later, in a museum where the fluorescent lights always buzz at the same low pitch, the Hind, airframe 84-24224, stands as a silent exhibit under a simple placard. People come and stand under its massive, drooping rotors and take photographs that make it seem smaller than the stories claim. No one in that room can feel the exact cold fear that passed through the office doors in the Kremlin in 1988. Time blunts even the sharpest edges. The machine's metal holds the memory of both loss and gain. It was once a trophy. It became a teacher. The power it once signified has been reinterpreted into an object lesson. Movement and openness can be more dangerous than any armor. In the end, the empty tarmac at Ouadi Doum is less an emblem of a theft and more a map of a choice. The machine that once sat there taught two hard lessons: that secrecy cannot outpace curiosity, and that the bravest tools are sometimes not missiles and armor, but the steady hands that can turn logistics into an art form. The Hind remained an artifact, the lesson was mobile, and it changed the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey into a pivotal, yet often overlooked, moment in modern history. If this story resonated with you, we would be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.